Do you ever wonder why you're doing what you do in life? Do you wish that you could be really happy and passionate about what you do? Or maybe you already are and you want to expand in a different direction. Hi, I'm Barbara Ann, host of What the Why? I love what I do. A lot of that has to do with my story, my journey to this point in life. And guess what? Everybody has a story. So please join me for conversations with leaders from all walks of life about what they do, and more importantly, why they do it, how they found their core purpose, their passion, their mission in life. And if you're looking for your own, maybe you'll get some great suggestions on how you too can find your why. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of What the Why. If you haven't seen us before, our show features conversations with diverse leaders from all walks of life about why they do what they do and how they figured out that this is their purpose in life. Whether you're looking to make changes in your life, your career, your company, no matter how big or small, all of our leaders have something in common with you. At some point, they felt similarly and they decided to do something about it. And today's guest, yet again, is no exception. We've been honored to have a number of really exciting guests, as they would say, where he is and where I am, from across the pond. And today, I'm really excited to introduce you to Alan Williams. Alan is the author, speaker, and founder of SERVICEBRAND GLOBAL. And what's interesting about that is it seems like it's kind of a standard corporate name, and it is anything but. SERVICEBRAND GLOBAL is focused on creating and implementing values-driven concepts. So it is not like any other corporate approach that a lot of companies out there are doing. And operating models, again, not your standard operating thing. What makes it different? Their whole goal is to create sustained positive impact. The delivery of award-winning projects in more than 30 countries. As a corporate executive management consultant and community leader, various non-executive chair director roles, founder of K20 and the Global Values Alliance, which I've been honored to actually attend some of their virtual things, and they have a big event coming up that we're going to talk a little bit about as well. He's also the co-founder of the World Values Day. And his personal core values, as you will see, you won't even question, are kindness, excellence, adaptability, creation, and enjoyment. I'm so excited to have him here. And so please, without further ado, join with me in welcoming Alan Williams to our show. So yay! Welcome, welcome,
Thanks, Barbara,
welcome.
and
So,
great to be here.
oh yes, and especially on such a beautiful day in both our locations. So
That's right.
happy to be here, because we don't always get that as we go into the spring. And before we dive into the amazing things that you are doing, volunteerism-wise, company-wise, I mean, fully embodying, I don't imagine that young Alan thought he would doing all of these world-changing things. So, as we ask every single guest from the very first episode, what did young Alan want to be when he was growing up?
Well, very young Alan wanted to be a drummer in a marching band. You know, the one that I think they stand at the front with the big drum that goes out like that, and they've got the two
Mm,
things bang bang like
the
this.
bass
So
drum.
yeah, that's it. So when I was about five, that was my dream. And then I also remember a little bit later on, I'm a big, well, you call it soccer, I call it football, big football fan. And I remember seeing the team win a cup in the UK called the FA Cup. And I said to my mum, I'm going to win that cup one day. So wanted to be a footballer, as do many young boys all over the world, and never got anywhere with it.
So how did you get from wanting to be a full footballer and win the FA Cup to making other global impacts?
Well, it's via hospitality, actually. So I didn't come from a very privileged background, and the only way out was university. And so when that was clear, and it became clear very early, I decided that I wanted to study something at university that would be able to get a job. So I knew people that would study, sort of very precise subject matter, but I was thinking, well, what are they going to do with that degree, and I was kind of attracted to the idea of business, but for some reason, and this is full of bias and prejudice, hands up, I thought that, for instance, I remember thinking working in a bank must be so boring, sitting in an office all day with a load of other people. And then I got a job when I was 16, a holiday job at a hotel. And that was it. From that moment, I knew that what I wanted to do was run commercial hospitality businesses. So I went to university to read hospitality management and went into that industry, became a leader in that industry, and that, I guess, was the beginning.
Wow. And so now your journey through hospitality management obviously took you on some interesting pivots because you've gone from, you know, working at entry level roles all the way up to helping brands focus on service. So how did you decide that this was something that was really important to you?
Well, I think it is about what hospitality gives you when you grow up in that environment. So it teaches you a couple of things that I've transferred into the consulting work that I do with leaders internationally in the UK. So the first thing is your guest or customer is the most important person in the world. And, any business, if you don't have customers, you don't have a business, right? So it's very simple. And then the second one is a bit more nuanced, and that is that the second most important person is the person in front of the customer representing the business.
Mm.
And still to this day, so many people underestimate the importance of that. And over decades, I've been a big champion of the power and importance of people in those customer facing roles.
Mm. To the extent that you can talk about it, what are some of the types of companies? I mean, it sounds like you started with hospitality, but your reach has been much further than that.
Yeah,
So, so what are some of the types of companies, to the extent that you can talk about it, that you've worked with to help them on their journey to really focusing on the customer and the team and the values that they stand for?
yeah. Well, before I go into the specifics of sectors or companies, I think a general point to make is that when I moved from hospitality into other areas of business, I realized that what you take for granted in hospitality, which is the two things that I've just mentioned, and layer over that a real ambition for the team to work together as one team rather than in silos. And everybody understands that. When I moved away from hospitality, it dawned on me that not everybody got that, and it was a real eye opener. I was like, oh, so in this industry, they spend their time in meetings all day instead of with their customers and their employees, making sure that service is being delivered. And I remember we did it was like an invitation session in Hong Kong for an investment bank where we invited the general manager of the local Ritz-Carlton hotel to speak to the team, the service delivery team. And he said to the guys, could you tell me in percentage terms what percentage of your time you spend in meetings and what percentage of your time you spend with your customers and your employees? And you can guess what I'm going to say. It was kind of 80% in meetings. And he said, mine's the reverse. Take something from that. And we introduced a management by walking around policy. And this was fraught with challenge at the beginning because my colleagues, so we had a global board and then operating units in each of the locations delivering on the ground. And when I suggested this, my peers were saying, well, Alan, we're just far too busy to be, what are we going to get out of this management by walking around? And I was transparent and authentic. I said, I don't know what you're going to get, but you will get something out of it. And so what we agreed in the end was that they would trial it. So 1 hour a week for a month. And then we had a meeting to review. And that was a wonderful meeting because everybody said, we learned so much just by being out there in the business and going around. We need to do this through the business. So management by walking around is something that is so valuable, but it is this thing around we attach too much importance, I believe, to the known rather than diving into the unknown and exploring what might be there. And to answer more specifically your question, so different sectors such as I've mentioned financial services, but also logistics and tech, hospitality I've mentioned, retail, leisure. And it really, I've discovered that the type of sector really doesn't matter. What doesn't matter either is the level of maturity of the business or the size of the business or the geography of the business. If you apply the principles with respect for local differences, it works.
And it's interesting that you mentioned those different sectors because I had a former leader. Oh gosh, it's hard to believe that it's been 16 to 13 years ago.
Okay.
And that was the first time I had ever heard the term management by walking around. When
Okay.
he used it, and this was in a government role, and he had a former preacher who had been military as well. And so I was like, this management by walking around thing's kind of interesting. And that's just one of the many things that you do. Now you have some books that you've written, and
Yes.
and as people can see behind you, and one of them focuses on what you call the 31 practices approach for leaders to
Mhm.
bring the organizational values to life through employee behavior based on the core principles of conscious daily practice. So, now we touched briefly on the principles, but let's talk about the practices. Um, you know, I am curious. And I think my all of our listeners and viewers are as well. Um, what's up, for lack of better words, with the 31 practices?
So this is, again is inspired by Ritz-Carlton and Marriott. So I was a leader for a country club property just north of London, and they had a program called the Daily Basics. So this was focused on conscious daily practice, and it was service oriented. So it was a set of very simple service-based behaviors. So for instance, one of them was when you are within 12 feet of a guest, acknowledge them. And the reason this was used was because there was a realization that when we're busy, and sometimes when we're not busy, we kind of fall into autopilot and we do things less well than we know we can or should do them. And this focus on conscious daily practice of very simple tasks raised the bar. So this thing around, just greeting a guest, if you're walking down the corridor and you see a guest and you've got this daily practice in your head, you're going to say hello to them. Whereas if it's not in your head, maybe you just walk on by. So it struck me how powerful this was. And then when I moved on away from the hospitality sector into other sectors, I found that there was a lot of talk about values, and they had very expensive plaques on the wall or maybe etched into the wall at reception, these values words. But when you asked people, employees of the organization, what the values of the organization were, a lot of them didn't know. And even if they did know the words, and you then said, so what does that mean to you in your day-to-day work? They had no idea. So I thought, right, I'm going to take this idea from Ritz-Carlton and Marriott of conscious daily practice, But I'm actually going to make a few tweaks. So, for instance, I remember there were 23 of these behaviors with the hotel companies. And of course, that meant that they were never in sequence with the date. And my guys used to say to me, Alan, it's doing my head in. We're on practice number two, but it's the 17th of the month. How does that work? So I thought, okay, so I'm going to have 31 of these behaviors because then you're always on sync because there's no more than 31 days in a month. And for anybody that's listening, if there are only 30 days in the month or less, you just skip 31, you move to number one for the first of the month. So that was the beginning of the 31 practices. And the way that it works is that all of the employees in the organization are involved in creating them. So there's a process using creative thinking to ask the question, if the value of, let's say, excellence was alive and kicking around this organization, what behaviors would we see? So we have fun workshops creating those practices, and then they're distilled down into a draft version. That's then sent out through the business saying, this is what you guys have come up with. Is that right? Giving them another chance to make final tweaks. And then, of course, when it's launched, instead of the normal approach where it's here's a roadshow, we've employed an expensive agency to come up with this stuff, we'd now like you to do it, and nobody believes them. Instead of that, the message is very simple. It's the 31 practices that you created are going live on this date, and can you just do them every day? And that's all. And then we also work on really embedding the day-to-day processes to embrace them. So for instance, you might translate the 31 practices into a set of questions that everybody commits to use at recruitment. So it would be, Barbara Ann, one of our practices is meticulous attention to cleanliness and tidiness in honor of our value of excellence. So could you give me an example of when you've displayed that? And then another one is it's connected to the recognition program. So specific behaviors are recognized rather than, I don't know if you've experienced this, but a bunch of people around a table saying, who should we give the award to this month?
Yes.
So it really becomes what I refer to as in the guts of the business rather than on the periphery, which so often happens with values work.
Mm. And part of that commitment led to the Global Values Alliance, and the World Values Day. Um, like there's a lot of people who think of doing things like that, and then there are those who actually do them. How did you decide to move forward with founding the Global Values Alliance and World Values Day?
Well, I think this is a function of my desire to always get the best return on effort. I've not quite worked out whether that means I'm lazy or not, but I just like to get the best return on effort. And I was invited to join the team to create the UK Values Alliance. And very early on, I remember thinking, well, if we're going to put the effort into creating something for the UK, you might as well expand that and do something globally at the same time because you're putting in a similar amount of effort, but you're actually getting much greater return. So that was the reason. And then World Values Day came out of some discussions around there being so much fantastic work around the world in the values space, but it all being fragmented and disparate. So we thought, well, if we created World Values Day, that would create like a shop window in time for all of these messages to be celebrated and amplified in the world. So that's what we did. And we're coming up for 10 years anniversary of that now. And you mentioned courage. It's interesting because a couple of people have asked a similar question. And you know what? The weird thing is it doesn't feel like courage at all. It just feels like what you're going to do. And fortunately, sometimes it comes off. What you don't get to see, I suppose, is the stuff that you do something similar with that turns into nothing.
That's a really good point. Wow. Now, interestingly, with all that is going on in the world, it is not lost on me that your upcoming worldwide event is actually going to be happening in Florida.
Yeah.
the United
So
States.
this,
I think soon. So this episode's going to air before that. Let's talk a little bit about that because it's going to be very exciting. And also, before I do that, I want to give a shout out to somebody who's one state over from Florida, Joanne Morton, who introduced us. And for those of you who've been with us since the beginning, Joanne has been on the podcast and also embodies everything this is about. And as I understand it from her, is going to be attending. Um, so let's talk about the upcoming event in Florida.
yeah, let's do that. And actually, there's a connection with Joanne because Joanne is also part of the US Values Alliance,
Yes.
which I helped to set up with a guy called David Green as a result of the work that I'd started with the Global Values Alliance. So again, it's this thing around if you can be a catalyst around the world and start these things, you don't have to do all the work yourself. These guys are doing great work. And I attended an event recently where they were revisiting the founders' values for the US and asking the
Mhm.
question 250 years later, where have we got to with this, right? It was a fascinating event. But the K20, so this is a kindness initiative. And again, this is another story of following my nose because in January 2025, I had a call with Francesca Donlan, who is US based, and she had been writing up a post on LinkedIn every day for her act of kindness. And she'd committed to do that for the whole year. And I was super impressed by this. So I connected with her and we had a call. And in the weeks prior, I'd been developing this thinking around something that I'd labeled K20. And this is kind of in connection with the G20, which is all about governments coming together to inform policy. And I was thinking, well, what would happen if we could have government policy developed with kindness in mind? And then I started to think about if we could create a conducive environment for all of the people that currently operate in the space of kindness to connect with each other, collaborate together, and therefore create more positive impact. Wouldn't that be a great thing? So on the call, I described my early thinking to Francesca, and she said, "Oh, I just love this." And in fact, I know somebody at a university that might host an event for us sometime. So I said, well, that sounds great, but it sounds pretty vague as well. So why don't you explain to them that they have the opportunity to host the official launch of the K20 in May 2026? So on the Monday, she had a meeting. On the Tuesday, she called me and said, they're in. Can we send them a white paper for the university board to approve? We did that. And next month, it's happening. Crazy, right?
Crazy or possibilities? Either
Yeah.
one. Sometimes they overlap. And I just love the fact as someone here in the United States that it is happening in Florida in the United States next month. And there's
Well,
so much there that we can just leave it right there. Um, and so, these personal core values of yours that you've implemented, throughout your life. There are people, we've talked about David Green, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know as I've attended some of the U.S. Values Alliance things, Joanne Morton and others. Um, but to do the work that you do does require a support system. Who else would you like to acknowledge as people who have really helped move and shape the work that you're doing, both as an individual as well as a leader in this space?
wow. I would need all day to do that because I don't know if people have got an idea, but I'm probably involved in too many things for my own good. But the way that I deal with that is a bit like juggling plates. And so if I go and deal with one plate and one can wobble slightly, that's fine for a while. And then I just need to make sure that I get back to that one and get it going again. Um, and the way that I work, like I've described, if you can be a catalyst for others, so we mentioned David and Joanne and others, So all of the people in the US Values Alliance, for instance, they're just fabulous. All of the people that have helped us with K20 have been amazing. The UK Values Alliance, World Values Day, the books that I've written, loads of people involved in those as well. So it would just go on for far too long. And I know that I would leave some people out, which would be embarrassing.
And that's fair. And I think just the opportunity to know that you're even thinking about them is something that they appreciate, because they don't do it for the accolades. I want to be very clear. This is work that people do because it really is part at their core who they are. And
Yeah.
I suspect, like myself, you probably get the question, aren't you exhausted?
Well, no, because it's energy giving, not energy draining. And so it's just wonderful. I said to somebody the other day, I just find it a bit of a challenge sometimes keeping up with myself. And that's that's the way that it is. And actually, you talking about people not doing it for the accolades, that's exactly right. And this only dawned on me not last November, the November before. I was asked to do a talk about values and volunteering. And so I was thinking about what I would say in the talk. And I remembered that when I was around about 17 years old, I was a member of an environmental group called Friends of the Earth in Plymouth, which is a city in the southwest of the UK. And I remember us sitting around in a pub and people were saying, what could we do? What ideas has anybody got? And we didn't have any money. And so I suggested that we create a garden pairing scheme where we put an advert in the local newspaper for free and we invited people that had a garden that didn't want to work it to be paired with people who didn't have a garden and wanted to grow vegetables. And we eventually paired 20 groups of people and everybody was delighted. And it occurred to me that that approach of a values driven concept and operating model is what I then went on over a period of decades to implement, whether it be in an organizational setting or a community setting or a one to one setting. That's the approach I use. And in this talk, I use the phrase volunteering unveils our values. And the reason that's an important statement is because when you remove the extrinsic reward, all that is left is what is important to you. And that determines how you spend your time. So that was a real revelation to me, giving that talk and realizing the connection between values and volunteering.
And so as we start to wind down, I also want to point out that we've talked about the 31 practices, but we've also got two other books that you've also written. And I'm really curious about, so one is the values economy.
Mhm.
So as we live in a world right now where values are clearly not present in a lot of the economic decisions being made, uh, what prompted you to focus on that as a topic in one of your books?
Yeah. And actually, if I'm going to warmly challenge that statement about values not being present, because they are. It's just not the values that we would like to see present. They're always present. And the
Correction accepted. So,
the values economy really was about looking at the world in a different light because the business landscape, I believe, has fundamentally changed. And this is driven by three factors. There are others, but these are the three that I focus on. And by chance, they all begin with a C. The first is choice. So the research shows that 20 odd years ago, kind of 80% of our choices were driven by rationale and fact. Now our decisions have flipped, and more than 80% are driven by what's important to us or our values. So, for instance, fair trade is a good example of this, where people are willing to spend maybe a 30% premium on a bar of chocolate, not because it's better quality, not because it's better value for money, but because they believe that it gets to the shelf in the right way. right? That's what people are willing to invest in. And a caveat, obviously, if you haven't got the means, you're not able to make those sort of choices, perhaps. So you might believe in fair trade, but just not have the means to be able to buy fair trade chocolate. And so this is not saying that it applies to everybody. So choice is the first of these three factors. The second is communication. So this is really all about social media and the internet, where you're able to communicate your thoughts and feelings with millions of people all over the world in a heartbeat. That's a fundamental change from 20 odd years ago. And the final one is control. So it used to be that organizations owned their brand. So they would hire a marketing agency and invest in public relations, and they would just pump out a lot of messaging and kind of cross fingers, close eyes, and hope that enough people believed in it, right? Whereas now people don't believe so much the official corporate messaging. And anybody listening to this, think of this scenario where you meet somebody in a restaurant or a bar, and you share where do you work and this sort of thing. They tell you a company name, and you say, oh, what's it like working there? What they don't do is call up the website on their mobile and show you the official messaging. What they tell you is their felt experience of working in this place. And more importantly, you believe them more than you believe the official messaging on the website. So these three factors of choice, communication, and control create this perfect storm that I call the values economy, which is different than it used to be. And the book outlines how organizations can go about operating in that environment.
And we started this conversation with supercharging the customer experience, which of course is connected to everything else we've talked about and brings us back full circle. And so there are a lot of small businesses that are probably watching this right now. Most of our audience is in that group of people who the fear of change, for whatever reason, is just quite not, um, it's still overpowering the fear of staying the same. And so much of what you've outlined can make a huge difference. So what are some things that some of the companies and leaders out there that are watching and or listening to this podcast, now available on iHeartRadio in the United States and Apple worldwide as of Friday? Yay! So
Yay.
what are some things that leaders can do to supercharge their customer experience and help them move forward with the changes that they're looking to implement?
Yeah. So this might sound strange. I mentioned earlier that I operate a consulting firm. I would advise companies, leaders, not to go to consulting firms in the first instance. You have so much talent at your disposal within your organization who know what is happening. And so just ask them to start with. Also, don't get caught up in big change programs. Just start to identify the things that need to be done differently and get on with making them different. And then finally, I think I'm a bit biased because of my hotel background, but general management is so powerful when you see across the piece rather than allow the business to operate in operating silos who don't know what each other are doing, because you can realize so much in the way of synergies and you can avoid so much duplication and so much waste of effort. So I'd start with those three things.
Which is awesome. And yes, applause, applause, applause all the way around. Because I have seen, I love the fact you are the anti consulting superhero, the consultant that I've seen a lot of companies out there that have done some things that are completely contradictory to the message that you're spreading. So thank you for spreading that message. Um, for those who would like to reach out to you, your contact information will be available in the links below wherever you're accessing this video and or audio podcast. But what is the best way, verbally, that you can state right now for people to reach out to you and connect and learn more?
Yeah, probably LinkedIn is the quickest place to find. So if you just tap in Alan Williams service brand, I'll come up. And then the email address is alan@servicebrandglobal.com. start there, and then we'll see where we go.
Awesome. So, Alan, thank you so much for being someone who has the courage to step out and challenge and help people pivot their values within the workplace and within their companies. It's really been an honor to have you today as a guest, and I look forward to hearing more about how K20 goes.
Thank you, Barbara, and great to have a
Okay.
chat with you.
Yeah. And for all of you who are joining us and watching and or listening wherever you're accessing our podcast as it continues to grow across more platforms, we are so grateful that you took the time to join us. You have so many listening and viewing choices out there, and it means a lot to us that you took the time to listen and or view ours. And if you got any benefit out of this at all, please share this with someone else so that they can similarly benefit. And also, as we said at the beginning, please always remember, whether you're looking to make changes in your life, your career, your company, your relationships, whatever they may be, no matter how big or small. Join us again for more illuminating and fascinating and inspiring conversations with leaders like Alan, who, went through an interesting journey of his own through life to find his purpose and to live it.